Good evening, dear friend. I'm glad you're here. Perhaps the day has been long, or the house a little too quiet, or sleep has felt like a gate that swings but never quite closes. Come sit beside this soft lamp with me. We'll take the hours gently, with no sharp edges and no hurry. Tonight's story is a slow walk, hand on the banister, eyes adjusting to warm light, through life's most history books pass by. Before we go any farther, let's choose comfort on purpose. Dim the screen just a notch, loosen the shoulders. If there's a window nearby, open it the width of a palm and let in a tender draft. Maybe you hear a fan ticking softly, or the purl of evening rain against a sill. Pull a blanket over your knees the way someone kind might have done for you years ago. This is a small ritual, nothing grand, yet it lays down a quiet road for the heart to follow. Our path this evening leads to the edge of town, where lamps burn late and stairs remember every step. Not the painted legends of silver spurs and quick tempers, but the rooms above them. Places where women kept time with their own steady work, where coin and courage were counted carefully, where hope was folded like a handkerchief and tucked out of sight. We will not pry. We will not parade. We will stand in the doorway and listen for the ordinary sounds that kept a difficult world turning. There is a temptation, when speaking of such houses, to paint in bright colors. I'd rather set the brush in water and let the hues soften. Think of a porcelain basin holding an inch of warm water, a dress mended at the hem by lamplight, a ledger with figures written in a tidy, patient hand, a piano in the corner waking up at noon to the same old tune. Here, people learned to live with what was given and make what was needed. Some of it was hard, much of it was practical, all of it was human. If you're comfortable and the breath has slowed, I'll ask a small favor. If this kind of gentle history keeps you company, you're welcome to tap a like, to subscribe, or to leave a note telling me where you're listening from. I'm always charmed to hear it. Salt Lake or Savannah, a farmhouse in Iowa, a condo in Florida where the air hums with summer, or a quiet apartment 9 stories up somewhere I've never been. Write if you wish. It helps me imagine the circle we make together each night. Now, about tonight's heart. The world we're visiting is made of routines. A floor swept in arcs that never change. A pot of coffee that tastes of tin and resolve. A door latched not out of fear so much as habit. There are jokes tucked into the corners, crooked chairs that wobble, clocks that run 5 minutes fast, secret stashes that fool no one and everyone at once. There are rules too, unwritten, impolite to say aloud, guiding who enters first, who waits, who pays, who pretends not to see. And there are women, steady as a plumb line, who learn the house's creaks the way others learn a hymn. We will keep our voice low. In these rooms, the most striking moments arrive without fanfare. A knock may come at an hour when the hallway is still. A letter may travel 1,000 miles to say almost nothing and everything. A coin may disappear into a seam as if swallowed by the cloth. If there is a jolt tonight, it will be a gentle one. The turn of a key, the shift of a ledger column, the sight of a familiar face at the wrong time. No alarms. Only the kind of change that lets life continue. You may notice, as we go, how survival here looks like community more than combat. A kettle kept full for the next person. A word carried down the street to warn, or to help, or simply to spare embarrassment. A doctor who comes by the back door at 3 o'clock and says very little. A musician who plays the song that makes the room breathe easier. A madam who pretends to care only for profit and secretly keeps a second ledger where compassion is the currency. None of it dramatic, all of it necessary. There is sadness, yes, but of the ordinary kind, the kind we've all known in one form or another. The cost of things, the weight of habit, the ache of being spoken to as a role instead of a person. Yet you will find, tucked between the lines, a plain courage. Laughter that isn't borrowed, a hand resting a beat longer on another's shoulder, the relief of a plan that holds. Even weariness can be a companion, if someone sits with you while it passes. Tonight, we will name no villains and crown no saints. We'll look closely at the quiet labor by which dignity was maintained, a dress straightened, a room set right, a boundary kept with a smile that asked for nothing and gave nothing away. We'll honor the privacy of these lives while learning from their thrift of spirit, their good sense, their habit of getting through. If your pillow needs another soft punch, go on. If the room asks for one more notch of darkness, give it. Let the air move across the skin of your hands. Imagine the lamp burning low, the circle of light narrowing to a calm shore. Think of the road outside settling after midnight, the last voices drifting off, a horse stamping once in its stall, the town's breath evened out at last. That's the tempo we'll keep. Before we begin properly, allow me a small assurance. We will never look away from what is true, but we will look with kindness first. We'll place each fact in a saucer, the way you set down a teacup, and pay attention to the ring it leaves. We'll remember that statistics have faces and that the past did not happen to others. It happened to people much like us who preferred clean sheets, a fair chance, and an early bedtime. And so, friend, if you're ready, let's step into the first circle of our story. We'll start where so many honest histories begin, not with a proclamation, but with a private yearning. Somewhere in a small upstairs room, someone has turned down the lamp and listened to the muffled city. And, wish, no larger than a breath, has taken its seat beside them. That is where we'll place our chair. That is where we'll rest our hands. When you're settled, we'll open the window of the heart just enough to let that wish speak, not loudly, but clearly enough for us to hear. We'll call this beginning a quiet wish and follow it, step by patient step, into the calm work of an ordinary life. A soft wish lingers quietly in the night air. There is a hush that comes only when the town has truly given itself to rest. You know the kind, when even the clocks seem reluctant to strike, and the streets are emptied of all but the faint echo of a horse shifting in its stall. In such an hour, a person may discover the smallest of longings rising inside, tender as a thread of smoke. It asks for nothing loud. It does not call itself a dream. It is only a wish, and a quiet one at that. Imagine a narrow room tucked above the hum of a saloon, its walls holding more secrets than they could ever confess. The lamp on the table burns low, turning everything amber. Against that glow sits someone. Call her Sarah, or perhaps give her no name at all, listening to the muted sound of laughter below. Her shoulders ache from the day, but her thoughts float elsewhere, toward something simpler. She wishes, just for a moment, that tomorrow might be different. Not grandly different, not like stories in the papers, but in the plain way a person might hope for bread that is soft instead of stale, or water that runs clear and plentiful. This is not the kind of wish to rouse a chorus. It is a wish that lives in the spaces between tasks, when the hem is being stitched, when the cup is being rinsed, when the door is closed for the night. It hides behind routine and waits. And though no one would call it powerful, It is what keeps the body rising each morning and turning the handle once more. The truth is, history is filled with such wishes. They rarely make it into ledgers or letters, for they are not spoken aloud, yet they endure. They were there when women in mining towns pressed powder across tired faces, when men counted wages heavy with dust, when children whispered to one another in beds too crowded for comfort. The wish was always the same in shape. Let tomorrow be softer. Let me be seen as more than the work I do. Let the ache ease. Let the door open to something gentler. Tonight, as we lean close to the quiet of that imagined room, you might recognize your own longing folded inside theirs. We all carry it, though time and place differ. A wish to be safe, to be held kindly in memory, to trade harshness for ease. The hush allows us to admit it. Notice the lamp flickering. Notice the air, stale but carrying the faint sweetness of rouge and soap. Notice the way the woman's hand rests upon her lap, thumb moving in small circles as though tracing a pattern known only to her. That is the body giving shape to the wish, a gesture so small yet heavy with meaning. If we step back, we can see how this yearning fills the whole house. It lingers in the quiet cough down the hall, in the pause before a joke is told, in the way even the toughest among them glance once toward the window, as if to measure the distance to some other life. Each one holds a private petition, no two alike in detail, yet woven together in the same hush. Perhaps you've felt that in your own home, sitting in a chair while the world grows quiet, catching yourself sighing for something you can't name. That is kinship across the years. So we begin here, not with bustle or noise, but with a breath held gently in the dark, a wish that is neither shouted nor denied, only carried quietly, like a folded letter in a pocket. It is the seed of every story that will follow, for without it, there would be no reason to endure, no reason to dream, no reason to step forward when morning comes. Gentle footsteps trace the same worn paths each day. There are hours in a house when everything seems to follow a familiar choreography, as if the walls themselves remember the pattern. When the day begins in such a place, it is not with trumpets or alarms, but with the soft creak of a floorboard giving way beneath a bare heel, the low rasp of fabric being pulled into place, the rustle of a curtain being nudged aside to let in a cautious spill of daylight. These are the rhythms of ordinary survival, unremarkable perhaps, but steady enough to carry lives through another day. Imagine a narrow stairwell, polished by countless shoes though never scrubbed to brightness. A woman descends slowly, still shaking sleep from her limbs. She carries no tray, no book, only the faintest hope that the water left in the basin below will not already be cloudy. The house is not yet awake in full, and in this brief interlude, she owns the silence. The morning routine in such a dwelling is stitched together from small acts. The basin, as I mentioned, waits with an inch or two of water. One woman splashes her face quickly. Another rinses her hands and dabs at her neck with a corner of cloth. Tooth powder is passed from hand to hand, an unlovely concoction of baking soda or salt that grates more than it cleans. Yet even this ritual brings a touch of order, a reminder that there is a way to greet the day. Breakfast is plain. Cornmeal mush, perhaps, cooked long enough to thicken but rarely seasoned beyond a pinch of salt. Coffee, boiled black in a dented pot, bitter but dependable, fills chipped mugs. The women gather at the table in their worn dresses, voices low, gestures practiced. Some speak of dreams remembered, others of letters they hope might come in the next mail. One may joke about the taste of the mush, drawing a ripple of laughter that fades as quickly as it comes. It is not merriment so much as a reminder that humor has its place even here. After the bowls are cleared, chores begin. Sheets are stripped from beds and carried to the tubs out back, where water must be, hauled and heated before the heavy work of scrubbing can be done. Hands grow red and raw from the lye soap, eyes sting from steam, but the rhythm is familiar, and within it lies a certain comfort. Floors are swept, sawdust spread fresh to absorb the spills of the evening to come. Lamps are trimmed, their chimneys wiped clean of soot. The piano, waiting in the corner of the saloon below, is dusted even though no one will strike its keys until noon. Above all, there is mending. Dresses wear thin at elbows and hems, corsets lose their shape, stockings tear at the knee. Each garment is not merely clothing but a tool of trade, and so the needle is as vital as the coin. Women sit by windows where light is best, stitching patiently, sharing spools of thread, trading scraps of fabric that might reinforce a seam. In these quiet hours, conversation flows most easily. A story from childhood, a memory of a song sung by a mother now long gone, a whispered fear about a cough that lingers too long. No one judges, all understand. The house itself joins this rhythm. Doors swell with damp and must be nudged shut. Floorboards groan in protest at certain steps. The stove demands wood, its belly always hungrier than expected. Outside, the street wakes too. Hooves clatter, merchants shout, wagons grind their wheels into ruts. Yet inside the walls, the pace is slower, measured, as though the house insists upon its own tempo. By mid-morning, the work has shifted from maintaining the house to preparing the women. Hair is brushed and coiled, rouge applied sparingly to cheeks, lips tinted with whatever cosmetic can be afforded. A dab of perfume here, a borrowed ribbon there. Mirrors are few and unflattering, but the women know their craft well enough not to rely on reflection. They rely on each other. "Straighten that neckline," one says. "Your braid has slipped," another notes. They adjust and assist, creating a semblance of glamour where resources are scarce. There is a ritual that comes just before the doors open. The women gather in the main room, where the light falls slant through grimy windows. A small glass of brandy is poured for each, not for indulgence, but as a steadying tonic. Madame raises hers and says the same words each day. "To making it through." The glasses clink softly, a brief communion that binds them for the hours ahead. These rhythms might sound plain, perhaps even dull, but in their very predictability lies something precious. They are anchors in an unsettled world, patterns that say, "Yes, we will do this again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after still." For women who lived with constant uncertainty of health, of income, of safety, these daily rituals were a thread of continuity, something they could trust when little else could be. When afternoon comes, the piano begins, the doors open, and the rhythm shifts to one more public, more demanding. Yet even then, the quieter patterns endure. A glance exchanged across the room to signal caution, a hand resting briefly on another's shoulder to reassure, a step taken back at just the right moment to avoid trouble. These are the rhythms too, silent, invisible, but no less vital. Look closely, and you'll see how much these women depended on one another. They knew who needed more time at the basin, who should be first to use the bath when water was cleanest, who would swap duties when someone was ill. They carried one another in small ways, never loudly, rarely acknowledged, but deeply felt. Such care, practiced daily, built a fabric stronger than the walls around them. And so part 2 closes not with spectacle, but with the hum of daily life. footsteps climbing stairs, water sloshing in buckets, a song hummed under the breath as a hem is stitched. These were the sounds of survival, the music of continuity, the steady beat that allowed women to stand, dress, and step forward once again into the evening. Quiet walls hold the weight of unspoken fears. There are obstacles in life that do not announce themselves with crashes or alarms. They arrive quietly, settle heavily, and make their presence known in silences more than in words. These are the barriers one seldom names, the kind that hang in the air of a room like invisible smoke. To understand the rhythm of such a house, one must see not only the daily routine, but also the quiet walls that press against the heart. Consider the sound of coughing in the dark. It is not violent at first, only a dry tickle that disturbs the stillness. Yet each woman lying awake hears it and knows what it could mean. Tuberculosis, they call it consumption, runs swiftly in crowded rooms. A cough in the night is more than a nuisance. It is a shadow cast across everyone who breathes the same stale air. No one speaks of it directly, but when water is drawn in the morning, you notice the glance toward the basin, the pause before drinking, the hesitation before sharing a cup. That is how the barrier speaks, without words. There are other barriers too. The fear of violence, it hovers even in laughter. A man downstairs slams his glass a little too hard on the bar, and all at once the women glance at one another, assessing, calculating who might soothe him, who might step away. They do not speak it aloud, for to give fear a voice is to invite it closer. Instead, the body learns to read signals quickly. The slouch of a man's shoulders, the flush rising in his cheeks, the tremor in his hand as he reaches for the bottle. These signs tell more than words ever could, and the women carry that knowledge silently, like an extra layer of skin. Then there is the barrier of time itself. A woman's youth is currency, and she knows each day that it diminishes. She will not say this over breakfast, but she feels it when rouge no longer hides the tiredness, when laughter comes less easily, when a client glances past her toward someone younger. The house does not mark birthdays, for in truth, they are reminders of decline. Yet behind every smile lies the silent measure of time passing, ticking louder than any clock. Some barriers come from within the women themselves, memories that refuse to stay buried. A childhood scent carried on the wind might summon a father's anger, a mother's absence, a brother's farewell. No one speaks of these openly, but the body remembers. One woman stiffens at the smell of liquor on a man's breath. Another turns pale when a song is played on the piano. To outsiders, these reactions seem sudden, inexplicable. To those inside, they are understood, but never named. And what of society beyond the walls? Respectable women crossing the street to avoid brushing skirts against the building. Men who tip their hats politely in daylight, as though they were strangers to the very place they visited at night. Hypocrisy builds its own barrier, thick and suffocating. The women inside are not blind to it. They see clearly how the world profits from them, yet condemns them all the same. That knowledge hardens into silence, a wall too high to climb. But perhaps the most enduring barrier is the barrier of dreams deferred. Each woman carries some small vision, a dress shop, a return home, a quiet marriage, or even simply a chance to rest without fear. Yet each day those visions drift further away, eaten by expenses, dimmed by illness, crowded out by the urgent needs of survival. It is not that they forget. They simply learn not to speak of it, lest hope become another kind of wound. Picture Sarah at the window, needle in hand, her eyes fixed not on the fabric, but on the sky beyond. She does not say what she sees there, yet her silence tells all. Picture Lily stirring the stew at the stove, her jaw set, her gaze on nothing in particular. She does not complain, yet her silence is thick enough to taste. Picture Jenny, the youngest, humming tunelessly as she polishes glasses, her hands moving too quickly. She does not confess her fear, yet her silence trembles. These are the silent barriers, heavy as stone though unseen. They shape the posture of each woman, the way she tilts her head, the speed of her step, the force of her smile. They are not written in ledgers, not recorded in letters, but they hold the weight of entire lives. Sometimes, in the stillness just before the doors open, you can feel those barriers most clearly. The women gather in the main room, adjusting hair, straightening dresses, powdering cheeks. The brandy is poured, the toast is given, glasses clink, and then silence. For a brief breath, no one speaks. Each is lost in her own thought, her own reckoning with the barrier that presses most fiercely against her heart. It is a moment of truth too delicate to name and too heavy to hold for long. What does one do with such barriers? Mostly, endure them. The women learn to move within narrow corridors, to bend without breaking, to breathe through tight spaces. They do not dismantle the walls, for they lack the tools. Instead, they carve out small alcoves of comfort, a shared joke, a letter from home, a song hummed while stitching. Within those alcoves, the barriers seem less immovable. And yet, here lies the shock in its quietest form. The barriers, though silent, often decide the course of life more firmly than any loud event. A cough in the dark may lead to a grave. A silence at the table may grow into despair. A glance away may end a career. These things, unnoticed by outsiders, are the true engines of fate. So let us not be fooled by the noise of saloons or the glitter of rouge. The deeper story is told in silences, in the unspoken weight carried each day. And when the lamps are lit tonight and the laughter rises, those barriers will still stand, unseen, unnamed, but present in every gesture, every choice, every breath. In quiet faces, we see our own reflections. There are times when the light falls a certain way that one face becomes a mirror. You look at another, and without intending to, you glimpse a reflection of yourself. Sometimes younger, sometimes older, sometimes caught between what you were and what you might yet become. Inside the Silver Queen, among the hush of shifting skirts and the scent of rouge, such reflections appeared more often than one might expect. Consider Jenny, the youngest of the house, not yet grown into her own stride. 16, with hair pinned hastily and laughter too quick to be trusted. The others tease her gently, though beneath their teasing lies worry. When she blushes, it is not an act. When she giggles, it is real. She reminds the older women of their own beginnings, of that trembling first week when the paint on the cheeks felt like a costume too heavy to bear, and each glance from a stranger seemed a test. Jenny is a reflection of what they once were, fragile and raw, still learning the rhythm of survival. Now turn your gaze to Lily. She is older, not old, not yet, but she carries the mark of years lived in this work. Her humor is sharp, her eyes quick, her patience thin. She no longer startles easily, no longer dreams wildly. When she stitches a torn dress, her hands are steady. When she sizes up a client, her judgment is swift. She is what Jenny will one day become, unless life breaks her first. And Jenny, in some quiet corner of her mind, knows it. In Lily's weary glance, she sees her own future. That knowledge presses heavy, though unspoken. And there is Sarah, not the youngest, not the oldest, but balanced uneasily between. She holds on to dreams like fragile glass, polishing them carefully each night before tucking them back into her pocket. Her talk of a dress shop, of a ticket to San Francisco, of a room with lace curtains and a bell above the door. These are not idle fancies. They are plans written in invisible ink, fading with each day but never entirely vanishing. The younger women look at Sarah and think, perhaps I too might find a way out. The older women look and smile softly, for they have heard this song before, and they know how often the melody ends unfinished. Still, Sarah's hope reflects something essential, something they all carry but rarely confess: the belief that another life is possible. Reflection works both ways. The women mirror one another, yes, but they also mirror the men who climb the stairs. A miner with silver dust in his beard sees in Jenny a daughter he left behind, or perhaps a sister. He laughs too loudly, tips his hat too low, pretends his roughness is charm. Another man, more polished, looks at Sarah and imagines a wife he might have courted if not for the choices that led him here. For a fleeting moment, in the dim light, he believes he is buying not a service, but a glimpse of what might have been. And still another, older and tired, sits with Lily and finds in her dry wit a companion, someone who knows enough of hardship to laugh at it. In their eyes, the women reflect back longings never spoken, but the mirrors are not always kind. Sometimes, in the late hours, a woman catches her own reflection in a tarnished glass. The rouge is smudged, the powder uneven, the eyes ringed with fatigue. She hardly recognizes herself, and yet she cannot look away. It is a cruel reflection, a reminder of how time shapes the face without consent. She dabs at her cheeks, rearranges her hair, forces a smile. The mirror does not lie, but she tries to persuade it all the same. Reflections live also in gestures. The way Jenny twirls a curl between her fingers reminds Sarah of her own youth. The way Sarah pauses before stepping onto the street reminds Lily of her first doubt. The way Lily folds money carefully into a tin box reminds Jenny of her mother's neat hands counting coins at the kitchen table. Each woman, without speaking, holds pieces of the other's lives. They see themselves walking forward and backward at once. And then there are moments when reflection slips into something deeper: recognition. One evening, after the lamps are lit but before the crowd grows, Sarah catches Lily watching Jenny laugh with the piano player. There is a softness in Lily's expression, quickly masked but real. It is not jealousy nor pity. It is memory. She sees herself in that girl, remembers the weight of first hope, and for just a breath, she feels it again. Then the mask returns, the business continues, and nothing more is said. But Sarah notices, and in that noticing, she too feels a thread of kinship. These reflections are not always comforting. Sometimes they are warnings. To see one's possible future in another's weary eyes is to feel the ground tilt. Jenny learns this the first time she watches a man ignore her laughter and turn instead toward Sarah, paying extra for the steadiness in her gaze. Jenny smiles bravely, but the reflection stings. She understands, suddenly, that youth will not protect her forever, that charm is not a shield. Yet there is comfort, too, in knowing that one is not alone. The women of the Silver Queen may not always speak their hearts, but in each other's faces they read stories familiar as their own. They know what it means to long for escape, to dread sickness, to laugh despite fear. They do not need to confess. The reflection confesses for them. Beyond the walls, respectable society pretends not to see these women. But within the house, they see each other with clarity sharper than any sermon or law. That, perhaps, is why the bonds among them endure. When one falters, another steadies her. When one dreams, another listens, even if with skepticism. When one is lost, another remembers her name. They reflect not only what is, but what has been and what might yet come. Now imagine, if you will, the quietest hour of the night. The saloon below has emptied, the piano silenced, the lamps upstairs turned low. Jenny sleeps, curled like a child, a faint smile on her lips. Sarah lies awake, staring at the ceiling, whispering her dreams to no one. Lily snores softly, one hand still resting on the knife at her side. In this moment, the house itself seems to breathe, holding their reflections as carefully as a mirror catching moonlight. You might say that if one could stand outside and listen closely, the walls would whisper all their stories back at once. The power of reflection is not in its accuracy, but in its persistence. We look into others and find ourselves, whether we wish to or not. That is how humanity survives, by recognizing its own face again and again, even in places the world tries to forget. Sometimes kindness opens doors no coin can buy. There is a kind of key that does not jingle on a ring, nor glint in lamplight. It is quiet, weightless, invisible, and yet, when used, it opens more firmly than iron locks. The women of the Silver Queen knew this key well. They did not call it by any grand name. To them, it was simply kindness, the kind practiced in small ways, not as a performance, but as a means of survival and sometimes salvation. Consider the way Sarah folded Mary's shawl at the end of a weary night. Mary had coughed until her ribs ached, her face pale under the rouge. She had left her things in a heap at the foot of her bed, too tired to tend to them. Sarah, instead of collapsing into her own narrow cot, lifted the garment gently, shook it free of dust, and draped it across Mary's shoulders. It was a simple act, unnoticed in the dark. But Mary, half asleep, felt the warmth and whispered, "Thank you." Those two words were hardly audible, but they carried the weight of gratitude deeper than any coin earned that evening. Or Lily, who could be sharp-tongued and unsparing, yet who kept a stash of peppermint drops in a tin. She bought them from a traveling salesman once, intending to hoard them. But when Jenny cried quietly after a rough customer, Lily wordlessly set the tin on the girl's pillow. Jenny never forgot that. Years later, when she herself had grown older, she still remembered the taste of that peppermint, the sweetness of mercy when bitterness seemed endless. The key appeared in gestures larger, too. Madame Rosie, though stern, kept a small account book separate from her ledgers. In it, she recorded debts owed by the women. But every so often, she would quietly draw a line through a page. A gown ruined in a scuffle, a doctor's fee that stretched too far, a week of poor earnings during an illness. All forgiven, though never announced. The women pretended not to notice. She pretended not to care. But they knew, and knowing gave them strength to face another day. Kindness in the Silver Queen was not sentimental. It was practical. It was the mortar between stones, invisible, but holding the wall. Without it, the house would have crumbled under the weight of sorrow and fear. For what other reason would Jenny still laugh, or Sarah still dream, or Lily still guard the younger ones with fierce eyes? Think of the nights when storms rolled over Virginia City, when rain battered the thin roof and wind howled down the chimney. Customers stayed away then, leaving the rooms eerily quiet. On such nights, the women gathered in the kitchen, a pot of stew simmering slowly, the lamplight flickering against the iron stove. They told stories, some true, some invented, about families back east, about neighbors long gone, about childhood adventures. The stories were never polished, often meandering, but they were full of warmth. Each woman listened, nodded, laughed at the right places. These hours, unpaid and unseen, held them together as surely as any contract. There were moments when kindness took courage. Once, a drifter stumbled in, drunk and angry, demanding service though he had no coin. His words slurred, his fists balled. Jenny shrank back, but Lily stepped forward, steady as stone. "Not tonight, friend," she said. Her tone was calm, not confrontational. "You need rest, not more trouble." She guided him toward the door, her hand light on his arm. Somehow, her gentleness diffused what might have become violence. The man muttered, wavered, and left. No one applauded. But Jenny, heart still pounding, learned something that night. That kindness, offered without fear, could be a shield. It was not always easy. Kindness had its cost. Sometimes a girl shared her meager savings with another who had lost everything to a pickpocket. Sometimes she stayed awake to comfort a companion racked with nightmares instead of getting the rare sleep she desperately needed. Yet, they did it, again and again. For in a life where cruelty was common, mercy was a rebellion. The townsfolk seldom saw this. To them, the women of the Silver Queen were shadows in painted dresses, figures to be scorned in daylight and sought in darkness. But inside those walls, another truth thrived. Their kindness was currency more valuable than silver, more lasting than whiskey, more healing than any tonic. It was the currency of survival. Picture now a winter morning. The lamps have burned low. Frost creeps along the window panes, sketching delicate ferns in ice. The women, exhausted, drift to their beds. But before she lies down, Sarah tucks a blanket over Jenny's feet. Lily pours the last of the hot water into Mary's basin, so she might wash before sleeping. Madame Rosie, thinking no one sees, pauses at the doorway to listen to the soft breathing of her charges, her eyes uncharacteristically tender. These are not grand gestures. They are the quiet keys that unlock endurance. The gentle key was used, too, in letters never sent. Some women wrote to families far away, words filled with care they could not express face to face. "I hope you are warm tonight," one letter began. "I saved enough to send you a gift next month." The writer knew she could not risk revealing her true life, yet her words carried kindness across miles, hidden in the folds of paper. Such letters, whether mailed or not, comforted the writer as much as the imagined reader. And in the rare moments when customers showed kindness, the memory lingered. A miner once left behind a small bouquet of wildflowers on Sarah's nightstand. He said nothing, offered no explanation. The flowers withered within days, but Sarah pressed one between the pages of her prayer book. Years later, when her hands trembled with age, she found it again, brittle and faded, yet still fragrant with the memory of gentleness. Kindness did not erase hardship. It did not stop disease or banish fear or guarantee escape. But it softened the edges, dulled the sharpest corners, made the unbearable just manageable. Like oil on a squeaking hinge, it smoothed the motion of daily life. Soft rain at the window. In the hush of such nights, the women discovered that survival was not merely a matter of earning or avoiding danger or pleasing strangers. It was also about giving in small ways to one another. That was the gentle key. And though history often forgets such details, they mattered most of all. Soft close. So the Silver Queen endured, not through glamour or defiance alone, but through acts of mercy repeated in quiet rooms. And as the lamps dimmed and sleep at last crept in, the gentle key turned once more, unlocking peace for a few precious hours. The quietest moments often carried the heaviest truths. There comes a time in every story when the noise fades, and what remains is not thunder, but a stillness so deep it can feel louder than any storm. For the women of the Silver Queen, those moments often arrived in the hush between songs, in the pause before laughter, in the silence that followed bad news spoken too softly for outsiders to hear. It was in such a moment that Mary, who had been coughing for weeks, finally admitted what no one wanted to say aloud. "The doctor says it may not pass," she whispered one winter night. The words seemed to weigh the air down, to press against the frosted windows. No sobs followed, no outcry, just silence, the kind that makes one notice, the ticking of a clock, the creak of a board, the faint hiss of a lamp. Silence in the house could be dangerous. It often meant anger or fear, but sometimes it was sacred. That night, the women did not speak at once. Each sat with her thoughts, the reality settling in like snowflakes, quiet but undeniable. Sarah reached for Mary's hand, not with a speech, but with a squeeze, gentle and sure. Jenny tucked her shawl tighter, her young eyes wide, learning what words could not teach. Madame Rosie only nodded once, a gesture of grim acknowledgement, her face unreadable in the lamplight. The quiet carried through the following days. The piano played as usual. Customers came and went. Jokes were told, but underneath, each woman carried Mary's truth like a stone in her pocket. It was not discussed openly. No one wished to break the fragile thread of hope, but it colored their laughter, softened their voices, made their smiles more deliberate. Silence became their unspoken prayer. In the kitchen, spoons clinked gently against bowls, yet conversations faltered sooner than usual. At night, when the house finally emptied, the women lingered at the table instead of rushing upstairs. They let the quiet stretch, drawing strength from one another without a word. Sometimes silence held them steady. One evening, a drunk staggered in, shouting for attention. His voice rang harsh against the walls, breaking the fragile calm. Madame Rosie stepped forward, large and immovable. She did not yell. She simply stared until the man's voice trailed off. Then, with the faintest shake of her head, she guided him out. No violence, no spectacle, just silence, wielded as firmly as a weapon. And sometimes silence revealed truths long hidden. Jenny, the youngest, had often filled quiet spaces with chatter, fearing what might surface otherwise. But one dawn, as they sat together watching snow fall outside, she whispered, "I don't think I'll last here." The words came like a confession, trembling into the hush. Sarah did not answer, nor did Lily. Instead, they let the silence hold Jenny, as though it could cradle her fear without judgment. It was enough. Not all shocks thunder. Some whisper and never leave. There are shocks that strike like lightning, sudden, blinding, gone in an instant. And then there are the quiet ones, the kind that arrive softly, yet leave marks that never fade. At the Silver Queen, such a moment unfolded not with shouting, not with gunfire, but with a single knock at the back door on a night heavy with snow. It was late, long past the hour when customers usually stumbled home. The saloon below was empty, the lamps burning low. Only the faint clatter of Jim stacking glasses could be heard. Upstairs, the women had begun their slow rituals of washing rouge from their faces, unlacing corsets, stretching weary limbs. Then came the knock. 3 raps, steady but hesitant. Madame Rosie was the first to hear it. She lumbered down the stairs, lantern in hand, her heavy steps muffled by the sawdust on the floor. When she opened the door, A gust of cold air rushed in, along with a figure hunched in a threadbare coat. The lantern light revealed a boy, no more than 16, cheeks raw from wind, eyes darting with both fear and determination. "I'm looking for Lucy," he said, his voice cracking. The name fell into the room like a stone dropped in still water. Lucy. She had worked once at the Gem, a rival house down the street, until sickness carried her nearly to ruin. Whispers had drifted through the town. Consumption, they said, a cough that rattled like dry leaves. Few expected her to last the winter. "She's not here," Rosie replied firmly, her eyes narrowing. The boy clutched his cap tighter in his hands. "She's my sister. They told me she's dying. I came to take her home." The silence that followed was the kind that steals breath. Upstairs, the women paused, listening, the sound carrying through thin walls. Jenny's wide eyes sought Sarah's. Lily pressed her lips tight. In their world, families seldom came. Daughters left, and were rarely welcomed back. To see a brother arrive at a brothel's back door, pleading, not condemning, was a shock more profound than any pistol shot. Rosie studied the boy. His boots were caked with frozen mud. His hands, red and chapped, trembled as he held his cap. He had walked miles, perhaps days. He was not here to scold, nor to bargain. He was here to save what little was left of someone he loved. Finally, Rosie stepped aside. "She's at the Gem," she said, "but if you wait here, I'll send word." The boy nodded, relief washing over his face, though his shoulders still shook from the cold. Rosie motioned for Jim to bring stew, for one of the women to fetch a blanket. It was Jenny who moved first, draping her own shawl, thin though it was, over his shoulders. His thanks was whispered, almost swallowed by the night air. The word spread quickly among the women. Sarah leaned close to Lily. "He means to take her away." Tonight, Lily's eyes softened. They both knew what that meant. To leave the life was nearly impossible once debts were tallied, once one's face was known in every saloon. Yet here was family, flesh and blood, knocking at the door with nothing but determination. When the boy had eaten and warmed his hands by the stove, Rosie gave the order. "We'll help." Her tone was brisk, businesslike, but her eyes betrayed something else. Respect, perhaps, or recognition of a bond too strong to ignore. At 2 a.m, when the streets lay silent beneath a quilt of snow, Sarah kept watch from the upstairs window. She saw them, 2 figures moving carefully through the alley. The boy supporting a woman whose steps faltered, her breath visible in the frosty air. Even from a distance, Sarah could see Lucy's frailty, her frame bent, her face pale as candle wax. No one raised an alarm. No rivals came chasing. The snow muffled every sound, carrying them safely to a waiting wagon. Sarah's heart pounded, though she knew not why. It was not her sister, not her burden. And yet, as she watched the wagon roll slowly toward the edge of town, she felt tears she could not explain. When she returned to bed, Jenny whispered, "Did they make it?" "Yes," Sarah murmured. "They're gone." The room fell into silence. Not the heavy silence of fear, nor the brittle silence of grief. This was a silence filled with awe, the kind that lingers after witnessing something rare and sacred. In their world, escape was spoken of often, but achieved seldom. To see it unfold, not through coin or luck, but through love, shook them more than any violence ever had. In the days that followed, the story spread quietly among the houses. Women at the Silver Queen, the Gem, even the cribs on the edge of town whispered of the brother who came and the sister who left. It became a small legend, passed in hushed tones, a reminder that not every ending was written in the same ink. But for Sarah, it did more than stir conversation. It planted a thought she could not shake. If Lucy could leave, perhaps she could too. The dream of her dress shop in San Francisco, long recited like a charm, now glimmered with new sharpness. It no longer seemed like fantasy. It seemed, for the first time, possible. The shock, then, was not Lucy's frailty, nor her brother's arrival, but the quiet revelation it left behind, that escape was not a myth, that bonds of love could outweigh debts of coin, that perhaps, hidden in the snow and silence, there were doors waiting to be opened. Morning routines often hid the deepest strengths. The morning after Lucy's departure dawned as if nothing had happened. The snow still lay thick on the rooftops, chimneys puffed their sleepy smoke, and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer carried faintly up the hill. Yet for the women of the Silver Queen, the air seemed changed, touched by something invisible. They moved more slowly, more carefully, as if unwilling to break the fragile calm that lingered after the shock of the night before. Downstairs, the hearth burned low. Jim had risen early, as he always did, and the smell of coffee, strong and dark, hung in the air. One by one, the women filed in, shawls drawn tight against the chill. They settled around the scarred wooden table, bowls of mush and slices of salt pork passed hand to hand. No one spoke of Lucy, and yet her absence filled the room. Jenny was the first to break the quiet. "Funny, isn't it, how quiet feels louder sometimes?" she said softly, spoon hovering above her bowl. Sarah nodded, but said nothing more. She had slept little, her mind replaying the image of the wagon disappearing into the snowy night. For years, she had told herself her dream of leaving was a story she repeated only to keep despair at bay. Now, with Lucy gone, the dream felt sharper, almost tangible. She pressed the thought down like one presses folds into linen, neat and invisible. Rosie cleared her throat, ledger in hand. "Work doesn't pause," she said firmly. "Clients won't care what passed last night. They'll come with their pay and we'll be ready." Her voice cut through the haze, steady, practical. It was how she protected them all, by steering their eyes toward the day's business, by reminding them that survival did not pause for sentiment. Still, as she read out expenses, wood, coal, whiskey, doctor's fee, her tone carried a shade of gentleness rare for her. After breakfast came chores. The women scrubbed the wooden floors with harsh lye soap, knuckles reddening. They boiled linens in heavy tubs out back, the steam rising into the frosty air. Jenny hung dresses by the stove, repairing frayed seams with small, careful stitches. Mary, though still pale, mended a tear in her own bodice with patient determination, her hands trembling but steady enough. It was in these simple labors that the women found rhythm, even comfort. The act of scrubbing, stitching, tending the fire gave shape to hours that might otherwise have been consumed by worry. And within the rhythm lay something deeper, a strength hidden behind ordinary motions. When the water carrier arrived, hauling sloshing buckets into the kitchen, the women fell into practiced order. Sarah measured carefully, pouring first into the hip bath, then into smaller basins. Jenny fetched cloths for washing, humming faintly under her breath. The carrier, cheeks raw from the wind, glanced curiously at the women, perhaps wondering what private mysteries filled their walls. He never asked. He only tipped his hat and left, the door closing behind him with a thud. Later that day, Rosie called them into the sitting room. "There's talk in town," she said, folding a newspaper. "New rules being pushed, more eyes on houses like ours. We'll adapt, same as always." The women listened quietly. It was not the first time, nor would it be the last, that townsfolk sought to squeeze or shame them. Yet the words carried weight. Change was coming, slow and steady as snowfall. Sarah excused herself after, stepping into the upstairs room where the window framed a view of Virginia City's streets. She watched the movement below, miners trudging with tools slung over shoulders, shopkeepers sweeping storefronts, wives tugging children through snowdrifts. Ordinary life carried on, unaware of the tiny revolution that had taken place in their own house the night before. She pressed her hand to the cold glass, her breath fogging a small circle. For a moment, she imagined herself walking freely down the street, unmarked, unnoticed, as if she belonged among them. Evening came too quickly. The lamps were lit, their glow casting long shadows on the walls. Perfume mingled with wood smoke. Dresses brushed against one another as the women descended the stairs. Business returned with its usual force. Men laughing too loudly, boots stomping, coins sliding across the bar. The piano stumbled into tune, filling the air with weary cheer. And yet, beneath it all, the quiet lingered. The women carried it like a secret. A brother had come, a sister had gone. Love, stubborn and simple, had proved itself stronger than the rules of their world. In bed that night, Sarah turned toward the ceiling, listening to the muffled notes of the piano drifting up from below. She thought again of Lucy's pale face, of the boy's trembling hands. She thought of her own carefully hidden pouch of savings, coins rubbed smooth from being counted and recounted. She whispered a promise into the dark, not to anyone else, not even to herself fully, but to the silence that held her. One day, in small acts, futures quietly take shape. Evenings at the Silver Queen had their own rhythm. They began with the flare of lamps, the soft rush of skirts brushing against stair rails, and the smell of rouge and cheap perfume mixing with the wood smoke of the stove. Yet as the weeks deepened into winter, something else moved beneath the surface. The laughter came easier at times, the piano stumbled along, the glasses clinked against the bar. But among the women, threads of quiet resolve began to weave their way into every gesture, every silence. Mary, though weaker than before, stitched steadily in her corner, repairing hems for herself and others. Each neat line of thread seemed to speak of determination, the need to keep going, to stay useful, even as her cough lingered. Sarah watched her sometimes, wondering how much strength could be carried in such fragile fingers. It was not grand courage that filled the Silver Queen, but the steady kind, hidden in ordinary acts. Sarah herself had begun keeping her savings in the tin box with the false bottom, a small gift from Jenny weeks earlier. Every evening, after counting and smoothing the bills, she tucked them away with a care that bordered on ritual. She told no one how much she had gathered, nor how close she might be to her quiet dream of escape. Yet the act itself, the careful folding, the sliding of the box under a loose floorboard, was a whisper to herself, "I am not only what this house demands of me." Rosie, ever the watchful presence, noticed all of it, though she rarely said a word. She knew better than to pry too closely into the private corners of her girls' hopes. What mattered to her was steadiness, that they did their work, that the customers left satisfied and paid, that the ledger balanced at the end of each week. Yet there were moments when her voice softened, when she reminded Mary to rest, or when she brushed a hand across Jenny's shoulder as the girl passed. These were not the gestures of sentimentality. They were, rather, acknowledgments, quiet, unspoken, that survival here was built on more than commerce. Outside, Virginia City churned with its own struggles. Snow muffled the streets, but the clang of the stamp mills ran day and night, steady as a heartbeat. The town thrived and groaned with the flow of silver, and with it came men hungry for relief, distraction, or tenderness in whatever form they could buy. The Silver Queen stood as one of many houses that absorbed those hungers. Yet within its walls, the women shaped something different. A small, fragile community, one that outsiders could scarcely imagine. One night, Jenny leaned against the upstairs railing, watching the lamps below. "You think people will remember us?" she asked Sarah softly. Sarah, brushing out her hair by lamplight, smiled faintly. "Not by name." Jenny frowned. "Then what's the point of all this?" "The point," Sarah said after a pause, "is that we remember each other. That we get each other through the words, simple as they were, sank deep." Jenny turned back to the railing, silent, but her grip loosened on the wood. Soft piano in the background. The days folded into one another, dawn bringing laundry, mending, water hauling, dusk bringing whiskey, songs and laughter that sometimes reached the eyes and sometimes did not. Yet each repetition carried the weight of small decisions. A coin saved instead of spent, a letter written instead of left unsent, a kindness offered instead of withheld. Sarah began writing more letters to her cousin in San Francisco, careful to disguise her life while slipping in questions about rooms for rent, about supplies for a small shop. She wrote by candlelight, the scratch of pen on paper blending with the muffled sounds from downstairs. Hope, she knew, was fragile, but written words gave it form, however faint. Meanwhile, Rosie took steps of her own. She had spoken quietly with the bank director, arranged payments, and tucked away deeds. She was planning something larger, though she kept the details close. The women guessed, of course, whispers of expansion, of new rooms with real plumbing, of a future house safer and steadier. None pressed her for certainty. They trusted Rosie's instinct for survival, even if it came wrapped in secrecy. And so, resolve grew not in bold declarations, but in these hidden acts. Each woman carried her own thread, weaving it into the house's larger fabric. Mary with her stitches, Sarah with her savings, Jenny with her cautious questions, Rosie with her careful investments. Together, these threads did not make a tapestry of triumph. They made something humbler, but perhaps more enduring, a net strong enough to catch them, at least for now. Outside pressures quietly reshaped life within. The Silver Queen stood through the winter like an ember in the snow. Its lamps glowed golden against the drifts that piled along E Street, its stove smoke winding into the frosty night. Yet, beyond its walls, Virginia City hummed and groaned with changes that could not be ignored. In time, even the laughter and piano inside the brothel could not drown the murmurs from the wider town. It began with whispers. A minister's wife, stern in her bonnet, spoke at the church about purity. A new marshal wrote his reports with sharp pen strokes, eyeing the gambling halls and the saloons, but also the houses where women lived and worked by night. Petitions began to circulate, signatures gathered by hands that trembled between righteousness and secrecy. And though no one said so plainly, everyone knew which buildings on E Street were being marked in careful, disapproving ink. Inside, the women felt it like a chill draft under the door. Rosie never admitted fear. She was too old, too seasoned to confess unease. But she added another log to the stove each evening, as though warmth itself could fend off intrusion. "We'll adapt," she told the women. "Always have, always will." Her voice carried certainty, but her eyes, shadowed in lamplight, flickered toward the door more often than before. Mary, still recovering her strength, seemed to shrink at the talk. She stitched faster, as if each seam could hold the house together against whatever might come. Sarah, in her steady way, listened more than she spoke. She was writing more letters now, quietly preparing, though she tucked them quickly away when footsteps creaked on the stairs. Jenny whispered about rumors from the Magnolia House down the street. Raids, fines, threats shouted in the night. The younger women trembled, their jokes more forced than ever. And yet, amidst these shadows, the rhythms of the house continued. The piano still played its hesitant songs. Miners, their faces blackened by silver dust, still leaned at the bar, eager for whiskey and company. The women, dressed in their modest silks, smiled, laughed, poured, and led men upstairs. Business, fragile though it was, carried on. Survival demanded it. One cold night, Rosie called them together after the last customer left. The lamps burned low, shadows deepening across the room. "There's talk of ordinances," she said, voice steady. "Weekly doctor checks, licenses, higher fees. It will pass, or it won't. Either way, we keep on. But mark my words, this house will not fall for lack of planning." She laid out silver coins on the table, each gleaming in the wavering light. "These are the reserves. Enough to carry us if fines come due, and enough to carry each of you if the worst comes to pass." The women sat silent, watching the coins glint. The sound of the storm outside rattled the windows, but inside, a strange calm spread. Rosie was reminding them, without saying it outright, that survival depended on preparation, not hope, not prayers, but coins, deeds, and grit. Wind at the shutters, muffled footsteps. In the weeks that followed, they adjusted. Rosie struck quiet bargains with councilmen who visited by day in suits and by night in shadows. Jim, the bartender, carried gifts to the marshal's office, bottles of good whiskey, letters folded with neat banknotes. The piano player, old and wiry, spread rumors in other saloons that Rosie's house was respectable, that her women were cleaner, safer, better tended than elsewhere. These measures were not spoken of in the open. They drifted through the house like the scent of wood smoke, present, invisible, protective. But for the women themselves, life bent in subtler ways. They grew more watchful, not only of customers but of strangers who lingered too long outside, of the way respectable women pulled their skirts tighter as they passed. Every laugh was a little sharper, every glance a little more wary. The bonds among them tightened, drawn by the knowledge that, should the town turn against them, they would have only one another. And through it all, dreams did not vanish. Sarah still smoothed her letters by lamplight. Jenny still murmured of ribbons and escape. Mary still stitched, her fingers trembling but unyielding. These small, private acts were resistance in their own right, the quiet insistence that life inside the Silver Queen was more than what outsiders named it. One night, long after midnight, Sarah and Jenny stood by the frosted window, looking out over the darkened street. Snow fell in sheets, whitening the roofs, covering footprints, muting the noise of the town. "Strange," Jenny whispered. "How quiet it looks, like nothing's wrong at all." Sarah placed a hand on her shoulder. "That's the way of it. The world rarely shows its storms until they're already on us." They stood a while longer, silent, the weight of uncertainty pressing gently, insistently against the glass. And still, when the lamps were finally dimmed and the house fell quiet, they lay down in their narrow beds, knowing that tomorrow would bring the same routines. The basin of water, the rouge, the piano, the laughter that never told the whole truth. Small decisions shaped futures in unseen ways. The winter in Virginia City had settled deep, pressing its silence into every corner of the streets. Snow clung to the roofs, turned the narrow lanes into narrow corridors of crunching frost, and left the sky a pale gray that seemed endless. Inside the Silver Queen, life went on as it always did. Lamps lit, piano tuned, voices raised just enough to mask the fatigue that sat beneath every laugh. Yet, beneath that rhythm, choices began to gather like snowdrifts. Some were spoken, many were not. And each choice, whether whispered at night or folded into a letter, weighed more heavily than any coin counted at Rosie's desk. Sarah's letters had become a quiet ritual. Each week, she set aside an hour in the afternoon, when the light through the window was strong enough to see clearly, and when most of the others were asleep. She smoothed the paper carefully, dipped her pen in ink, and began to write in her tidy, deliberate script. Sometimes she wrote to her cousin in San Francisco, asking about the little shop for rent on a side street, not far from the wharf. Sometimes she wrote to her sister back east, though she often tore those letters up before sealing them. The act of writing, of shaping her thoughts into lines on a page, gave her hope that her life could still bend in another direction. Jenny watched her once, chin resting on her hands. "Do you think they'll really answer?" she asked softly, not mocking, not even doubtful, just curious in the innocent way that belonged to her. "They already have," Sarah replied, sliding a folded letter across the table. Jenny read slowly, lips moving, her young face brightening. "The street is quiet, good for business. The rent is fair. You would do well here." The words felt like a lantern against the cold. But choices like Sarah's were not made lightly. They required coins hidden away, days of patience, nights of resisting the easy comfort of whiskey or the lure of spending on ribbons and rouge. Each saved dollar meant another step toward the door, and yet each coin weighed heavily. To save was to admit that leaving was possible. To admit leaving was to face the fear of what lay beyond the walls. Mary's choice was different. She had survived her illness, or at least the worst of it, but she had emerged with a quiet fragility. She stitched and mended as always, but more slowly now, as though each pull of the needle carried the weight of memory. One evening, as the others dressed for customers, she lingered by the stove, fingers brushing the worn wood. "I think I'll go to Carson City in the spring," she murmured. "I heard there's a shop there needs a seamstress." The women paused, adjusting hairpins and corsets, surprised by her calm declaration. Mary had spoken little of leaving before. The silence that followed was not disbelief, but respect. They knew what it meant to voice such a choice. It was like stepping out into the snow barefoot, terrifying, painful, but proof of courage. Rosie said nothing at first. She only studied Mary with those sharp eyes of hers. At last, she nodded. "If you go with my blessing. But wait for the thaw. Roads are too cruel in winter." It was not permission exactly, but it was support. And support was a rare gift in this world. Jenny wrestled with her own choices in quieter ways. She was only 16, and yet her laughter often rang the loudest, her rouge applied the brightest. But she watched the older women carefully, learning from their silences as much as their words. One night she confessed, barely above a whisper, "I don't want to be here when I'm 20. Sarah reached for her hand. "Then you won't be." "But you must plan, Jenny. Wishing isn't enough." Jenny nodded, eyes wide. That was the hard truth she was beginning to understand. Survival here was not only about tending to customers, but about tending to one's own future. Thread by thread, coin by coin, fire crackling softly in the stove. Meanwhile, Rosie's choices were heavier than all. She bore the weight of the house itself, of its survival against laws, storms, and human cruelty. She counted coins with precise care, bargained quietly with men who walked in by night and passed her by in daylight. She invested in deeds, in parcels of land, in shares of businesses whose names her girls never spoke aloud. One evening, after closing, she summoned them all to the parlor. On the table lay not only coins, but papers folded and sealed. "These are for the future," she said, "for when I am gone, or when this house no longer stands. None of you will be left with nothing. That I swear." The women exchanged glances, startled by the gravity in her tone. Rosie rarely spoke of endings. To hear her acknowledge them was both frightening and strangely comforting. Sarah asked quietly, "Why now?" Rosie looked into the fire, the lines of her face deepened by its glow. "Because I've seen the tide turn before, and I feel it turning again. Choices made now will matter more than laughter tomorrow." The room fell silent. Each woman absorbed her words in her own way, the flames reflecting in their eyes. Life in the Silver Queen continued. Piano songs, miners' jokes, rouge on pale cheeks. But beneath the surface, choices gathered like snow piling unseen in the night. Small decisions, whether to save or spend, whether to write or remain silent, whether to trust or to guard one's heart. Each choice was quiet. None rang like a gunshot or shattered like glass. Yet together, they shaped the paths that would lead these women forward, or hold them back, long after the snow had melted from E Street. Bonds grew strongest where the world looked away. The season had turned again. Outside, Virginia City groaned under the weight of late winter. Snow pressed into ruts by wagon wheels. The boardwalks slick with ice. The miners still trudged to the shafts before dawn, their boots crunching against the frozen ground, faces hidden behind scarves. Inside the Silver Queen, warmth lingered, lamps glowing steady, the stove humming, the piano resting in the corner, waiting for the evening to begin. Yet warmth came not only from coal or oil, but from something less visible, a sisterhood woven thread by thread among the women. It was not a sisterhood anyone outside the house would recognize. Respectable women walked past with their eyes averted, skirts lifted clear of the building's threshold. Town fathers pretended not to know Rosie in daylight, though their coins sat heavy in her ledgers by night. And yet, behind closed doors, these women became each other's family, binding together not with shared blood, but with shared survival. Sarah often said little, but her presence steadied the room. When Jenny laughed too brightly, Sarah's hand on her arm reminded her that she didn't have to pretend so hard when customers were gone. When Mary stitched by the window, coughing softly, Sarah slipped her a spoonful of honey from a jar, bought with her own savings, murmuring, "It helps." Mary, in turn, repaid such kindness not with words, but with thread. She mended hems, reinforced seams, adjusted bodices so that her sisters might walk into the saloon looking just a bit more polished, a bit more prepared for the harsh eyes of men. Her needle, guided by tired fingers, gave them an armor of sorts, even if it was only cotton and silk. Jenny, the youngest, carried stories. She filled quiet afternoons with tales she half remembered from childhood, about a river near her home back east, about games played under oak trees. She painted pictures of green grass and clear skies, reminders that the world held more than saloons and snow. The others listened not for the accuracy of her stories, but for the way they lifted heavy hearts, if only for a few minutes. Lily, sharper in tongue and quicker in wit, became their lookout. She had a way of spotting trouble before it grew teeth. When a man's laugh turned too loud, when his eyes lingered too long on a knife left on the bar, Lily's glance or muttered warning gave the others time to steer clear. Protection didn't always come from Rosie's derringer. Sometimes it came from a glance, a whispered word, a sister's quiet signal. And Rosie, who carried the weight of the house, bound it all together. She was not motherly in the gentle sense, but in the hard, weathered way of someone who had known storms and refused to see others drowned if she could keep them afloat. She made the rules. No customer upstairs without payment first. No man too drunk to walk. No woman left alone if she cried out. They were rules as old as the trade, yet under Rosie's hand, they became more than business. They became the boundaries of safety, fragile but real. Soft lamp glow, stove humming low. One evening, after the saloon had emptied, the women sat at the table with mugs of weak coffee. Outside, snow fell heavy, muffling the clamor of town. Inside, silence pooled comfortably. Jenny broke it at last, eyes shining in the lamplight. "If I ever make it out of here, I'll start a boarding house. A clean one, with decent food. None of this stew and cornmeal." The others chuckled softly. Sarah leaned back, her voice a murmur. "You'd fuss over everyone like a hen." Jenny grinned, unbothered. "Maybe. But I'd give the girls clean sheets. Real sheets, with lavender soap." Mary, her needle paused mid-stitch, whispered, "Imagine that." Her smile was faint, but it lingered. That night, as the wind howled against the shutters, they let themselves imagine, each in her own way, better rooms, safer work, laughter not forced. They knew dreams could be fragile, like glass left too close to the fire, but even fragile dreams gave warmth when the cold pressed in. Days passed, marked by the rhythms of mining shifts, piano tunes, footsteps on the stairs. Yet beneath the routines, threads of sisterhood grew stronger. When Sarah received a letter from San Francisco, the others gathered around, not to pry, but to share the weight of hope written there. When Lily sprained her wrist one night, defending herself against a customer's roughness, Mary stitched her sleeve tighter so the injury wouldn't show, while Jenny carried her share of chores without complaint. Rosie watched it all, silent but approving. She knew that no law, no sermon, no sheriff would ever call these women sisters. But she also knew that sisterhood born of hardship could be stronger than kinship of blood. One morning, when the waterman delivered his buckets, he lingered to talk, boasting of a new well-being dug near Gold Hill. Rosie paid him his coin, then closed the door firmly. "Remember, girls," she said, "the world outside won't give you kindness. You make it here, together." The words settled deep, remembered later in moments of weariness. That spring, Mary finally gathered her courage to leave for Carson City. The others stitched a ribbon into her bag, each taking a turn, not as ornament, but as a piece of themselves to send with her. Sarah slipped in a coin she could spare. Jenny tucked a sprig of dried lavender, tied in thread. Lily pressed a small note with a single word. "Remember." Rosie clasped Mary's hand, eyes uncharacteristically soft. "Don't look back," she said. Mary walked out into the thawing streets, her figure small against the rising sun. And though they would not see her again, the house felt strangely fuller that night, as if her courage had left a warmth behind. Wind softening outside, a chair creaking gently. Sisterhood in the Silver Queen was not spoken of in public, not written in newspapers, not recorded in ledgers. But it was there, in shared meals, in mended seams, in whispered warnings, in coins slipped into another's palm. It was unseen by the world, but it kept them alive, kept them human, Even in silence, the town pressed close. Outside the Silver Queen, Virginia City rolled on with its restless rhythm. Wagons creaked over frozen mud in winter, then raised dust clouds in summer heat. Men stumbled to and from the shafts, coughing up ore dust. Children ran barefoot in alleys, chasing dogs or shouting for penny sweets. The town moved around them like a current, and though the women of the Silver Queen stood apart, marked, judged, and often shunned, they could not help but feel its pull. In the early morning, before customers came, Sarah liked to open the window a crack, letting in whatever breeze carried the town's voice. Sometimes it was the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, sometimes the long, mournful call of a mule driver, sometimes church bells, ringing with a tone that made her chest ache, though she had long stopped attending any service. She would close her eyes, listening, imagining herself not separate from the life below, but quietly stitched into it. Jenny, restless as ever, watched people pass by from behind lace curtains. "See that woman?" she'd whisper, pointing with a tilt of her chin toward a figure in a fine bonnet. "Bet she's got pies cooling on her windowsill. Can you even imagine that smell?" The others would smile faintly, though the ache was sharp. Pies on a windowsill belonged to another life, one most of them had lost too young. Soft creak of floorboards, faint wind through shutters. The town and the brothel were bound by contradictions. During the day, ladies crossed to the other side of the street. Children were tugged away quickly, and sermons thundered against houses of ill repute. But when night fell, boots lined the boardwalk outside, coins changed hands, and familiar voices called greetings as though sin had its own schedule. Rosie understood these contradictions better than anyone. She had seen the town council accept donations for a schoolhouse without looking too closely at the source. She had sent baskets of bread to families in need during harsh winters, her name never spoken in public thanks, yet never forgotten when the next crisis came. "They'll never claim us," she told the women one evening as she counted coins into neat stacks. "But they'll take what we give, all the same." That night, Sarah asked very softly, "Do you ever mind?" The question hung in the room. Rosie didn't answer right away. She pushed another stack of coins toward the ledger before finally saying, "Mind? Number. It's the way of things. Some folks live on daylight, some on lamplight. We all keep the town running, whether they admit it or not." And so it was. The miners needed escape. The saloon needed music and warmth. The barkeeps needed customers. Even the doctor, even the law found profit in the quiet agreements that tied the brothel to the town. Invisible threads, strong as steel, though seldom spoken of. One afternoon, a traveling photographer arrived in Virginia City. He set up his bulky camera on the boardwalk, offering portraits for 50 cents. Respectable families queued in their Sunday clothes, boys fidgeting, girls fussed over by mothers. The women of the Silver Queen watched from their upstairs windows. "Wouldn't it be something," Jenny whispered, "to have a picture of ourselves? Not just in memory, but real. Proof we were here." Mary gave a tired laugh. "What would we do with it? Hang it in the saloon?" Yet even she, weary and skeptical, leaned closer to the window. That evening, after the customers had gone, Sarah sketched a quick likeness of the group at the table by lamplight. Her drawing was crude, lines uneven, but it caught something the camera never would. The quiet bond, the tilt of Jenny's head against Lily's shoulder, Rosie's hand resting firmly on the table as if anchoring them all. Sarah folded the sketch and tucked it into her bodice, whispering, "So, we don't forget ourselves." It was these small gestures that kept the women tethered not only to each other, but to the wider world, even if the world denied the connection. The town's festivals were another echo that reached them. 4th of July parades marched down C Street, children waving flags, brass bands blaring. From their windows, the women watched, laughing quietly at the drunken soldiers trying to keep step. Sometimes Rosie allowed them to throw coins down to candy sellers below, just for the pleasure of seeing children scramble, their giggles rising like bells. On Christmas Eve, carols drifted through the frosted glass, sung by townsfolk gathered near the church. The women pressed close to the panes, their faces reflected back faintly in the glow of oil lamps. None dared step outside to join, yet each hummed softly along, voices blending in a hidden harmony the carolers would never hear. Church bells, faint in the distance. Still, the line between town and brothel was never steady. There were moments when it blurred. Once, a fire broke out in a bakery 2 doors down, flames licking through the roof. The women rushed into the street alongside townsfolk, forming a bucket line, skirts soaking, arms trembling. No one asked who they were. No one turned them away. In the urgency of saving the building, they were simply neighbors. The next day, of course, respectability returned. Skirts lifted once more as women passed the Silver Queen. But the baker's wife delivered a loaf of fresh bread, wrapped in cloth, left at their door without a word. Rosie accepted it with a nod. "This is how it works," she murmured. Back and forth, seen and unseen. There were darker echoes, too. When the sheriff's office grew bold under pressure from the temperance ladies, raids were threatened. Whispers swept the town before they reached the brothel itself. Sometimes it was a miner, grateful for an evening's kindness, who tipped them off. Sometimes a shopkeeper's boy, slipping a note through the back door. Warnings arrived quietly, proof that even those who could not publicly defend them still felt the ties that bound. On such nights, valuables were hidden beneath floorboards, papers burned, exits prepared. The women knew well how fragile their position was, protected one day, exposed the next. Yet as Sarah often whispered, the town may turn its face away, but it never truly forgets we're here. The greatest contradiction of all lay in the children. Some of the town's boys grew up delivering coal or water to the Silver Queen, eyes wide at glimpses of rouge and silk. Some of the girls grew up avoiding the house entirely, only to find themselves, years later, walking its stairs when hard times came. The circle turned quietly, a fact few acknowledged, yet all understood. One spring evening, Jenny spotted a young girl loitering near the back door, thin, pale, clutching a bundle of clothes. Rosie ushered her inside, gave her stew, asked no questions, until the girl's shaking stopped. By morning, she had a bed in the attic, small but safe. "The town will say nothing," Rosie told the others. "They'll pretend not to see. But they'll know she's here, and that she's alive." And so the echoes went both ways, the town shaping the brothel shaping the town, each denying the other in daylight yet meeting in shadows, where human need was stronger than social judgment. Soft hush of snowfall outside, muffled voices below. Echoes carried far in Virginia City. A cough from the street reached the women's ears upstairs. A burst of laughter from the saloon rose through the floorboards. Bells from the church drifted through the night, mixing with the clink of glasses. These sounds reminded them daily that though their lives were hidden in plain sight, they were never separate. Even numbers and lists carry human warmth. The Silver Queen might have looked, at first glance, like a place of smoke and laughter, of piano chords rising into the lamplight and footsteps across worn floorboards. Yet behind all that, Behind the crimson curtains and clinking glasses, there was another heartbeat, quieter, steadier, hidden in the pages of a ledger. Rosie kept her books on a desk that had once belonged to a lawyer, a sturdy walnut piece bought second-hand when his office failed. The drawers stuck, the brass handles were dulled, but she polished it with oil each week, her large hands surprisingly tender as they traced the grooves in the wood. Numbers mattered here, just as much as rouge or laughter, maybe more. For in those columns, neat and unyielding, lay the true measure of survival. When the house quieted in mid-afternoon, Rosie would sit with her spectacles perched low on her nose, turning pages already filled with tidy rows. Each line held a story, a night's worth of earnings, a doctor's bill, the cost of coal hauled up C Street, the bribes slipped to deputies who pretended not to notice the steady stream of customers. The women gathered around her sometimes, not as performers, but as partners, curious to see how their lives, reduced to ink and figures, stacked up against hope. Soft shuffle of papers, faint creak of chair. It was not unusual for Rosie to read the week's totals aloud. "Jenny," she would say, tapping the page with her pencil. "You've done well. $52 clear after expenses. Lily, 38. Sarah." And Sarah, listening with folded hands, would nod quietly as her name was called, though her mind already counted how close she was to her goal. How many weeks remained until her savings might be enough for the dress shop? Numbers could be cold, but in that room, by the light of a single lamp, they carried something else. They were dreams translated into figures. They were lifelines measured in dollars and cents. They were time itself, marked not by days, but by how many coins could be stacked in a drawer before luck turned or illness came. Expenses were as real as breath. There was rent, of course, to Mr. Holcomb, who never came himself, but sent a clerk with pale eyes and careful hands to collect. There was the liquor bill, always heavier than expected, for customers drank freely, and watered-down whiskey still cost money. There was the coal and wood, the water carried in sloshing buckets, the piano player's wages, and the doctor's visits that no one wanted to pay, but all depended on. 15 to the marshal, 10 to the deputy, Rosie would add with no change of tone, as if those payments were as natural as bread. They were, in their way. To live in peace in Virginia City, one paid what was asked. And so, in the neat columns, protection money sat beside soap and thread, equal in weight. Jenny once asked, almost shyly, "Do you ever think of it, Rosie? All the good this could have done if it weren't hidden under our roof?" Rosie had smiled, the corners of her mouth tugging downward, as if the weight of years resisted any upward curve. "It does good, girl. Just not in the way polite folk will say out loud. That church bell that rings on Sundays, half its bronze was bought with coin from houses like this. They'll never admit it, but I know." The others nodded, a silence falling that was not bitter, but strangely peaceful. For in that moment, the arithmetic of survival and the arithmetic of community felt joined, even if the ledger said nothing about it. One evening, the women asked if they might count for themselves. Rosie agreed, pushing the ledger toward them, her spectacles glinting. Sarah took the pencil, her handwriting narrow but steady. She whispered the numbers as she wrote them down. 3 for the new lace, 5 for coal, 2 for flour. Lily leaned over her shoulder, lips moving silently as she did the math in her head. It was Jenny who broke the hush, laughing softly. "I never thought I'd be glad for sums. Used to hide from them at school." The others chuckled with her, yet no one looked away from the figures. For there, in tidy ink, they saw themselves, not as the world named them, but as women keeping accounts, As partners in a business they kept afloat with their bodies, their wit, and their patience. Rosie watched them closely, nodding once, as though satisfied. You should always know what you're worth. Never let anyone else be the only one counting. That night, as they put the ledger away, the women felt a strange dignity. Not pride exactly, not joy, but a recognition that their lives were more than whispered judgments. They were labor, recorded and weighed, and even in secrecy, that knowledge gave strength. Beyond the numbers, dreams made their own arithmetic. Sarah whispered that she needed $500 to leave. Jenny confessed that she wanted $20 more for a sewing machine she had seen in a shop window. Mary admitted she was only hoping to save enough for a winter coat lined with rabbit fur. Each goal was different, yet all were written silently in the columns of Rosie's book. Each coin carried not just value, but intention. When Sarah placed a silver dollar in her small tin box, she did not hear only the clink. It was the faint rustle of fabric bolts waiting in San Francisco. When Jenny added her coins, she imagined the steady hum of a sewing needle, a second income whispering of freedom. Even Mary, weary and cautious, thought of warmth against the biting wind. The scratch of pencil on paper, faint ticking of a clock. Sometimes Rosie would trace a line under the totals, her pencil pressing hard enough to groove the paper. "This week we've done well," she'd declare. "This week the house stands." And the women, though they knew tomorrow could undo it all, would breathe easier for a while. The ledger also held darker entries. When Mary fell ill, the doctor's bill appeared in stark ink, larger than any week's earnings. The women stared at it in silence, their own numbers diminished by her need. Yet none complained. Rosie had simply written, "Mary, half pay during recovery," and the ledger accepted it without protest. It was perhaps the truest thing about that book. It carried not only arithmetic, but compassion, smuggled between columns. A loss shared, a debt forgiven, a kindness recorded not for others to see, but for those who lived it. Sometimes, after the sums were done, Rosie would close the ledger with a thump that sounded final, as though she had sealed away the week itself. She would lean back in her chair, spectacles sliding low, and say, "Remember, girls, these are not just numbers. They're hours you've stood, smiles you've held, nights you've endured. Every mark is a piece of you. Guard it well." The women never forgot those words. Even Jenny, light-hearted and restless, repeated them under her breath some nights as she counted her coins. Every mark is a piece of you. Futures begin as sketches whispered in hope. Evenings at the Silver Queen carried a rhythm as steady as the ticking of a clock. Yet within that sameness lived small sparks, dreams too fragile to voice loudly, yet too persistent to disappear. They came out in whispers over mugs of coffee after the doors were locked, in the quiet rustle of skirts while mending a hem, or in the softest tones just before drifting into sleep. Dreams in that house were not written in ledgers, as Rosie's numbers were, but sketched in the air, uncertain, tentative, like pencil lines drawn lightly on paper. A dress shop, a sewing machine, a home in Denver, a chance at anonymity in San Francisco. Each woman had her version. Jenny was often the first to speak. She was younger than the rest, her laughter still carrying the brightness of someone not yet dulled by years. She would perch on the edge of the big kitchen table, legs swinging, eyes alight with possibilities. "I'll have a little room of my own," she would say, "with a big window where the morning sun comes through. I'll sew curtains myself, blue ones with white lace trim." She said it so often the others teased her, but beneath their smiles, they envied the clarity of her vision. Curtains, sunlight, small things that meant ownership, safety, a space untouched by anyone else's demand. Mary's voice, in contrast, was quieter, more cautious. Illness had taught her to guard hope carefully. "I only want enough for warmth," she admitted once, holding a length of worn shawl against her shoulders. "A fire that I can keep lit all winter, and shoes stout enough to last." It was not a grand plan, but it was hers, and when she spoke it, the others grew solemn, as if the modesty of it cut more deeply than grandeur. Sarah's sketches were sharper, drawn with the deliberate lines of someone who measured twice before cutting cloth. She had her figures memorized: $500, the cost of bolts of fabric, rent for a small shop on a decent street, enough to cover her until customers came. When she whispered of it, her eyes did not drift away like Jenny's, but fixed steady, as though she could already see the neat rows of dresses hanging by the window, the sound of scissors snipping in steady rhythm, soft crackle of a stove, faint hum of wind outside. Sometimes Rosie listened without speaking, her large hands folded across her apron. She had lived enough years to know that not all dreams survive the weight of time, yet she did not discourage them. Instead, she would nod and say, "Keep them close, girls." A dream spoken aloud has a way of planting itself. Give it time, and it might take root. The women treasured those words. In a world where judgment came easily and kindness rarely, to have their hopes acknowledged was itself a form of grace. There were other sketches too, less practical, but no less real. Lily once confessed she dreamed of travel, though she had never been farther than Reno. "I'd like to see the ocean," she whispered, eyes wide as if picturing endless water was almost frightening. "To stand where the sand shifts beneath your feet and nothing fences you in." Just horizon upon horizon, Jenny clasped her hand in sudden delight. "We'll go together," she said. "We'll dip our toes in and laugh when the waves chase us back." They laughed at the image, the sound filling the room like bells. For a moment, the Silver Queen felt not like a brothel, but like a house where friends planned holidays. Not all sketches were voiced. Some stayed hidden, flickering behind eyes. A woman might hold a photograph folded in cloth, staring at it before bed, imagining a reunion she dared not name aloud. Another might finger a locket, picturing a child somewhere far away, wondering if she could ever return without shame. These unspoken dreams had their own weight, heavy as stones carried silently in pockets. Rosie understood even those. She herself had once sketched futures long gone. She never spoke of them, but sometimes, as she closed her ledger, she stared at the flame of the lamp as though it carried faces only she could see. The act of sketching futures, whether aloud or in silence, was itself resistance. Against the rhythm of nightly labor, against the judgment outside, against the creeping fear that this was all there would ever be. To dream was to assert that tomorrow might be different. Even the smallest sketches mattered. Jenny once doodled on scrap paper with a stub of pencil, clumsy lines of a house with smoke curling from the chimney, flowers planted along a fence. The drawing was crooked, but she pinned it by her bed anyway. "Just so I don't forget," she explained shyly. And in the dim light of morning, that crooked house held more beauty than the fanciest gowns they wore downstairs. Soft rain tapping faintly on the roof, a lull in the night. What shocked them most was not that they dreamed, but that they shared them. Outside, they had to be performers, masks polished to please. But in those quiet hours, they allowed themselves the vulnerability of hope. They teased, they doubted, yet they listened, and in listening, they lent each other courage. It was Sarah who put it into words. Alone, I'd lose heart. Together, even the foolish dreams feel possible. Rosie, stirring her cup of coffee, gave a grunt that was almost agreement. That's because you remind each other who you are, not just what you do. And so, in the soft hours between closing and dawn, the house filled not with laughter meant to charm or songs meant to distract, but with the gentle hum of imagination. Futures sketched lightly, erased, redrawn, adjusted, like seamstresses pinning fabric, testing the fit, daring to believe in garments not yet sewn. Around one table, voices became shelter evenings at the Silver Queen had their noise, the clinking of glasses, the laughter polished until it rang like tin, the creak of boots on wooden floors. Yet once the lamps were lowered and the last customer pushed gently into the night, a different sound filled the house. It was not silence, though silence might have been easier. It was something richer. Voices unguarded, softer, carrying weight they dared not show in the daylight. The table in the kitchen bore the marks of many years, scratches from knives, scorch marks from hot pans hastily set down, rings left by mugs of coffee. It was not a grand piece of furniture, but it became the heart of their evenings. Around it, the women of the Silver Queen gathered, their hair unpinned, their faces washed of rouge. They slipped into plain shawls and slippers, leaving behind the masks they wore downstairs. Low hum of kettle, stove crackling faintly. Rosie would sit at the head, though not because she insisted. Her size and presence simply filled the chair there, and the others gravitated toward her, as if the table itself tilted in her direction. She rarely spoke first. Instead, she listened, her broad hands wrapped around a mug, her gaze steady as the rest eased into words. Jenny, always restless, leaned forward, elbows on the table, despite Rosie's gentle scoldings. Back home, she would begin. My mother used to sew late at night. I'd fall asleep to the sound of her foot on the treadle. Her eyes shone as she spoke, and though none of the others had met this mother, for a moment they too could hear the rhythmic creak of the old machine. Sarah often followed. Her words were measured, her tone careful, as though weighing truth against memory. My father used to read to us in the evenings, she said once, surprising them. The paper would crinkle in his hands, and his voice, steady, like water against stone. I never thought I'd miss that sound, but some nights I do. The table absorbed their stories like wood takes in oil, darkening, deepening, carrying them forward. It wasn't only memory they shared. Sometimes it was raw confession. Mary, hands trembling slightly, admitted one night, "When I was sick, I thought I'd never rise again. I dreamed I was lying in the snow, and the snow was warm." The words startled them, yet the table held steady, offering space without judgment. Rosie reached across, resting a heavy hand on hers. "You're here," Rosie said simply, and that was enough. Lily, sharper of tongue, softened in these moments. She spoke of a childhood where laughter was scarce, of brothers who left for war and never came home, of a mother whose sternness hid worry. "I didn't think I'd miss her," Lily confessed, her voice low. "But when I burned my hand last winter, I caught myself wishing she'd scold me for being careless." The others chuckled gently, not at her pain, but at the strange truth of it, that even harsh love, remembered, could ache like longing. wind brushing against window panes, faint rattle of shutters. What made the table remarkable was not just the stories, but the way they wove together. No one voice overpowered the rest. They overlapped, interrupted, filled pauses with murmurs of agreement or sighs of recognition. The cadence became like a lullaby, one voice rising, another falling, the chorus a patchwork quilt stitched from many lives. Sometimes Rosie broke her quiet to tell a tale of her own. She never spoke of beginnings, how she came to this work, what roads led her here. But she offered fragments: a winter spent in Montana where food was scarce, a night in a mining camp when she'd kept watch with a pistol across her knees, a friend long gone who once sang so sweetly that men wept. Her stories were less about herself than about survival, about how people endured and how memory itself became a form of endurance. The younger women leaned in, listening as though hearing scripture. They did not flatter her with praise. They didn't need to. The respect lived in their stillness, in the way they let her words settle without rushing to fill the silence afterward. One winter night, snow pressed hard against the windows. The stove glowed and the women huddled close, shawls pulled tight. Conversation slowed, but the table still gathered them. Jenny traced circles in spilled flour. Sarah hummed a hymn half forgotten. Lily poured the last of the coffee into chipped mugs. The sound of the storm outside reminded them that the world could be cruel. Yet here, within these four walls, they belonged. And then came a question, simple but heavy, spoken by Mary. "Do you ever think we'll be remembered?" The table grew still. Each woman sat with her thoughts, the only sound the stove sighing as wood settled into embers. It was Rosie who finally answered, voice steady. Not by name, maybe, but by what we built, by the streets we helped pay for, by the schools with roofs because of our coins, by the laughter of children in towns we kept alive. That's memory enough. The words hung in the air, gentle as snowflakes, weighty as stone. The others nodded slowly, their eyes glistening in the lamplight. Ambient pause, kettle whistling softly before being lifted from stove. What shocked them, though perhaps it shouldn't have, was how much lighter they felt after these evenings. The burdens of the day didn't vanish, but they shifted. Pain seemed less sharp, fear less consuming, when spoken into a circle of listening hearts. The table did not erase hardship. It transformed it, shaping it into something bearable. Sarah once said, "It's like patching a quilt. Alone, each piece is ragged. Together, it keeps you warm," and everyone murmured agreement because they felt it. Even when disagreements arose, and they did, as all families quarrel, the table absorbed them. Lily might snap at Jenny's youthful impatience, or Mary bristle at Sarah's careful accounting of every penny, but the table held steady. By the end of the evening, apologies slipped in quietly, as naturally as refilling an empty mug. Every stitch held a secret hope. The days at the Silver Queen blurred into one another. Work came and went. Miners rose from the shafts with dust in their lungs and silver in their pockets, and the lamps in the saloon flickered through the hours of evening until dawn crept pale over the horizon. Yet within that steady cycle, the women found small threads of something different, not always visible to the passing eye, but present. Hints of escape, strands of possibility that they tugged at in quiet moments, as one might pull gently on a frayed seam of cloth. Sarah had her dress shop dream. Everyone knew it by now. She spoke of it not with flamboyance, but with the steady certainty of someone counting coins in the dark. She had a cousin in San Francisco, and letters passed between them like secret keys, envelopes with cramped handwriting promising to check on storefronts, to ask about fabrics, to see which neighborhoods were safest for women alone. Every letter Sarah received, she tucked carefully into a box beneath her bed, wrapped in a scarf to keep it safe from dust. Jenny, younger, more impulsive, often spoke of travel. She wanted to see the ocean, not just as a line of blue in her imagination, but the real thing, endless and salty and wild. "I'd walk right into it," she declared one night, voice bright with the daring of youth. "Not to drown, but to feel it push against me, to know something bigger than this town." The others smiled indulgently. Rosie shook her head, but there was affection in her frown. Mary, still fragile from her illness, stitched her escape in quieter ways. She had begun mending clothing with unusual care, her fingers nimble on the needle. One evening, she confessed, "I think about opening a small sewing room. Nothing grand, just a place where women bring torn dresses and I patch them. A steady trade, not a fortune. Enough to live without owing anyone." There was a hush at the table after that, the kind that comes when someone dares to imagine survival as something gentle rather than desperate. Soft crack of thread pulled through cloth, lamplight steady. Lily's hopes were sharper. She spoke less often, but when she did, it carried weight. "Land," she muttered once, gazing into her mug. "That's what lasts. A piece of earth nobody can take. You can plant on it, or you can sell it, but it's yours." Rosie, who understood the truth of property, nodded solemnly. She herself had deeds tucked away, investments made with shrewd foresight. But for the younger women, land seemed like a dream too heavy to lift. Still, Lily clung to it, a vision of soil under her fingernails instead of rouge on her cheeks. Their dreams wove together like threads of different colors, some bright, some muted, some nearly invisible, but all part of the same cloth. Around the kitchen table, or in whispered conversations by the stairs, they returned to these visions, shaping them slowly, as if hemming a garment. There were setbacks, of course. Letters went missing. Savings slipped through fingers when unexpected doctor's bills arrived, or when a slow week forced them to spend rather than store away. More than once, Sarah had to begin her count again, her neat stacks of coins diminished by the cost of medicine or protection money. Jenny, too, sometimes spent rashly, buying ribbons or trinkets with money she promised herself she would save. Rosie scolded her, but softly, as one scolds a child for chasing fireflies instead of tending the lantern. Even Mary, careful and frugal, lost a week's earnings once when a drunken customer refused to pay, and she lacked the strength to fight him. Rosie handled it, of course, sending Jim to collect, but the money never returned. Still, Mary stitched on, her fingers working in rhythm, as though sewing could restore what had been taken. Wind rattling faintly outside, stove humming low. What surprised them most was how their hopes intertwined with one another's. Sarah's talk of a shop stirred Jenny's imagination. She saw herself not drowning in the ocean, but perhaps sending parcels of bright ribbon across the waves. Mary, mending clothes, thought about Sarah's shop too. "Maybe I could work in the back room," she whispered, her voice soft with longing. "People wouldn't even need to know I'd been here." And Lily's dream of land seemed suddenly less impossible when tied to Sarah's careful savings. A small plot on the edge of a city, perhaps, where a shop could sit at the front and a garden stretch behind. Rosie watched all this with a mixture of pride and caution. She knew too well how fragile such plans could be. Still, she never discouraged them. Dreams were tools, she understood, just as much as knives or ledgers. They kept women upright, gave shape to long nights, turned despair into something they could measure and fold. The nights carried whispers of practical escape, too. Sometimes, word spread that a girl in another town had slipped away with her savings, boarded a train, and vanished into a new name. Other times, darker stories reached them. Women who left only to fall into worse places, or to return broken, unable to find work, unable to shed the shadow of the life they had lived. These tales lingered like ghosts, reminders that escape was not always freedom. But still, the threads remained. One evening, Sarah laid her coins on the table for the others to see. Stacks of silver and a few worn bills, nearly enough for the shop. Jenny clapped her hands softly. Mary touched the edge of a coin as if it might vanish, and even Lily allowed herself a rare smile. Rosie said nothing at first, only studied the small fortune with eyes that had seen too much. Then she nodded once, as though blessing the effort. Whisper of snow against glass, fire sighing. The shock, the quiet shock, came not in violence, but in tenderness. One night, Sarah returned from the post with a letter pressed tight in her hand. She didn't open it at the table. She climbed the stairs, her face unreadable, and only later did she share its contents. Her cousin had found a place, small, in need of repair, but a shop with windows onto the street, and a back room where she could live. The room grew still. Jenny gasped. Mary clasped her hands. Lily leaned back with a sharp exhale. Rosie said only, "Then it's time to prepare." That night, they spoke long into the dark about what Sarah would take, what she would leave, how she would travel, who might see her off. Each suggestion was practical, but beneath the talk lay something deeper, the knowledge that her departure would change them all. Slow ticking of unseen clock, steady as breath. And so the threads of escape thickened into cords. Sarah's plan gave shape to Jenny's wanderings, to Mary's sewing, to Lily's land. It reminded them that doors, however narrow, could be found. It gave them courage, though they did not all admit it. At the table that week, Mary spoke softly of writing her sister again, even though silence had hung between them for years. Jenny said she might start putting aside coins instead of ribbons. Lily grumbled, but admitted she had asked Jim to find out about small plots for sale near Carson City. Even Rosie, after the others had gone to bed, sat alone at the table with her ledger open, calculating not just profit, but possibility. The threads were fragile, yes, they could fray, but together they formed something stronger than despair. They formed the beginning of a cloth sturdy enough to carry weight. Night closes gently, holding every secret. The town of Virginia City lay beneath a quilt of quiet. The lamps along the main street had burned low, their light softening into amber halos that trembled in the thin winter air. Inside the Silver Queen, the echoes of music had stilled. The piano's last chord lingered only in memory, and the clink of glasses had faded into the hush of closing. Upstairs, doors creaked softly as the women settled. The air was warm with the scent of wood smoke, faint perfume, and the lingering traces of tobacco that clung to skirts and hair. Somewhere below, Jim finished his final sweep of the bar, the scrape of broom bristles steady and patient, like the slow heartbeat of the house itself. Rosie sat alone at the big kitchen table, ledger closed before her, hands folded loosely as if in prayer. Around her the chairs stood empty now, but in her mind she could see the women who had filled them, laughing, fretting, counting coins, daring to dream. She knew each of their voices by heart, each sigh, each burst of laughter, each quiet confession. The house was quieter than it had been in months, though not silent. It breathed in its own way, with the soft rustle of skirts laid aside, with the occasional cough, with the sigh of beds accepting tired bodies. Soft crackle of embers, faint wind tapping the shutters. Sarah lay awake, her eyes open to the shadows on the ceiling. The letter about the shop was tucked beneath her pillow, its weight a comfort against the restless currents of her thoughts. She imagined the shop windows, dusty perhaps, but hers to clean. She saw bolts of cloth stacked neatly, a bell at the door to announce customers, the back room with its small bed and table. In her vision, light poured through those windows, and her hands were busy not with rouge or ribbons, but with scissors and thread. Jenny, in the bed across the room, had drifted into the kind of sleep only the very young can manage. Curled like a kitten, hair spilling across her cheek, lips parted. She dreamt perhaps of the sea she had never seen, of waves that rose and fell like the breath of a giant world. Her fingers twitched, as if reaching for something she could not yet name. Mary, still frail but recovering, had a half-mended hem folded beside her pillow. She had worked on it until her eyes blurred, the small stitches tight and even. The cloth held her attention as surely as prayer beads. In it, she stitched her hope, a room of her own, a steady trade, mornings measured by the sound of a needle instead of footsteps on the stairs. Lily lay nearest the window, and her dreams were heavier. She dreamt of dirt, of soil dark and damp, of planting seeds with her own hands. Her land did not yet exist, but in her mind she could already feel its weight, the permanence of something that could not be swept away with the night's customers. Downstairs, Rosie leaned back in her chair and let her eyes close. She was not asleep, not yet, but she was adrift in a tide between thought and dream. She saw the Silver Queen as she had first built it, raw wood, rough hands hammering, sawdust still thick on the floor. She saw the faces of women long gone, some who had escaped, some who had vanished, some who had simply worn themselves out until they faded from the story. She felt their voices lingering in the walls, woven into the grain of the wood, a choir of memory. There had been times when she wondered why she stayed, why she didn't fold the ledger, sell the house, and vanish into some quieter life. But she knew the answer. This place, for all its shadows, was also her creation, her fortress, her offering to women who had nowhere else to go. She had carved from a harsh world a small island of safety, imperfect but hers. She rose at last, stretching her stiff back, and moved to bank the fire. The red coals glowed like watchful eyes, steady and warm. She whispered to them as though they were old friends, then turned toward the stairs, her heavy steps careful not to wake the women above. Whisper of stairs creaking, house sighing in its sleep. Outside, the snow had begun again, fine flakes drifting in the lamplight. They softened the edges of the rough wooden buildings, hushed the rattle of shutters, blurred the sharpness of the world. Virginia City lay blanketed, every rooftop and alley held in quiet equilibrium. For the women inside the Silver Queen, this night was both ordinary and extraordinary. Another cycle ended, another to come. Yet beneath the routine lay something shifting. Plans whispered, futures forming, threads pulling taut toward something new. Sarah's departure loomed like dawn itself, inevitable, unstoppable, carrying both promise and loss. The others knew it would mark them all. A house changes when one of its voices falls silent, but they also knew that such departures made their own paths more real. If Sarah could do it, perhaps they could too. At the edge of sleep, the women's breathing settled into rhythm, a quiet chorus rising through the old beams of the house. Outside, the snow covered every footprint on the street, as though erasing the struggles of the day. Only the faint glow of the church steeple remained, bell silent, its shadow long against the whitened ground. In this stillness, the Silver Queen seemed less a place of business and more a shelter, a lantern in the dark. Within its walls, women who had been cast aside by the world found, if not redemption, then at least recognition. They saw one another. They held one another upright. They stitched their futures with thread finer than silk, but stronger than steel. Hope echoes of a different time. The years of the Silver Queen belong now to history. The clatter of boots on wooden stairs, the murmur of women whispering through thin walls, the piano tunes drifting above the hum of voices. These sounds have faded into silence, swallowed by time. What remains are stories, softened by distance, reshaped by memory, yet still carrying the weight of what those women endured. In those days, life was narrow, and choices were fewer than we can imagine now. A woman's worth, measured so often by appearances or by marriage, left little space for independence. Work beyond the home was rare, and when it did appear, it carried wages that could barely feed a family. For some, the path that led to the brothel was not born of scandal, but of survival. The hardships they faced were both visible and invisible. Disease lingered like a shadow, with no cure but patience or dangerous potions. The law, when it came, seldom brought protection. Instead, it brought fines, raids, or quiet arrangements behind closed doors. Respectable women crossed the street rather than pass too close to the painted doors, and yet their husbands and brothers might slip inside those same doors when the night grew long. We can look back now with a gentler eye. It was another age, governed by rules that feel impossibly rigid today. In that world, the women of the Silver Queen found ways to endure. They made routines of washing in gray water, stitched torn hems by candlelight, and held one another upright when illness or despair threatened to pull them down. These quiet acts of care, often unseen, were their form of rebellion. They kept one another alive. The contrast with our present is striking. Today, clean water flows freely from a tap, a simple twist away. A doctor's advice is available without fear of public shame. Choices, though still uneven, are broader. A woman can learn a trade, start a business, walk into a classroom or an office, and be seen for her skills rather than dismissed for her past. What was once extraordinary survival is now an expectation of safety. And yet, looking back, there is value in remembering the severity of that earlier life. It reminds us how precious the ordinary comforts of today are. The bed freshly made, the quiet hum of heat in winter, the light that comes with a switch rather than a match. These simple things were once rare luxuries. When we close our eyes tonight, it is worth pausing to think of them. The women who carried burdens heavier than their years, who dreamed of shops, of farms, of lives that would free them from the relentless toll of the house. Their struggles do not ask for pity, but for remembrance. They endured in a world harsher than ours, and in doing so, they left behind a lesson in resilience. Shadows and light time reshapes memory in curious ways. The harsh winters of Virginia City, once filled with icy winds that cut through wooden walls, are softened in recollection into gentle snowfalls, drifting across empty streets. The ceaseless roar of stamp mills, pounding silver ore into dust, fades into the hum of history. A sound few can now imagine. And the lives of women who once carried the burdens of survival in brothels are remembered not in the sharpness of their daily trials, but in the quiet persistence that allowed them to endure. We forget, sometimes, how narrow the space for choice truly was. A young woman in the 1870s might stand at a crossroads with only 2 or 3 paths open before her. None led to ease. Marriage could mean safety, but also confinement to a husband's will. Factory work paid pennies and wore the body thin. And so, some stepped through painted doors, not from desire, but from desperation. Their rooms were small, their beds shared, their lives judged harshly by those who depended upon them in secret. And yet, within those walls, they created bonds that outlasted the nights. They stitched dresses together, shared remedies brewed from bitter herbs, guarded one another's small treasures hidden in boxes beneath floorboards. Every coin saved, every letter received, every whispered promise of leaving someday was a fragment of hope clutched tightly against the dark. The silence of the law spoke volumes. Men who enforced order on the streets turned their eyes away when it came to the women of the houses. Their protection was often purchased, not given, and so women learned to protect themselves. Knives hidden in garters, plans whispered in the dark. Survival was not written in grand gestures but in the details. An exit left unlatched, a coin slipped into a friend's hand, a smile that concealed fear. When we look at our lives now, the difference is profound. Illness no longer carries the same shadow, for medicine has caught up to what was once mystery and dread. A cough no longer signals the slow toll of consumption. It meets the simple relief of treatment. A wound does not fester into fever. It is cleaned, stitched, healed. These ordinary mercies are gifts of progress, invisible because they are everywhere, but worth pausing to notice. Women today may choose paths once closed entirely, to study, to lead, to speak openly of dreams without fear of scorn. The narrow corridors of the past have widened into roads that branch in many directions. Though the world is not perfect, its horizon is broader, its gates less locked. Still, remembering the past matters. Those women of another century remind us that resilience grows in the harshest places. They held laughter on their tongues even when sorrow pressed against their ribs. They danced when music was scarce. They shared bread when hunger pinched. They looked after one another in ways the world refused to. Their humanity, tucked into those dimly lit rooms, is a light we can still see if we choose to look back. So as the night deepens around us now, with warmth within reach, with quiet choices of comfort, blankets pulled close, lamps turned low, let us think of them, not as shadows of shame, but as women who bore the weight of a time less forgiving. Their legacy is not in the judgments cast upon them, but in the strength they carried silently. Lessons in hardness. There was a hardness to life long ago, a kind of steady weight pressing upon people from the moment they woke until the hour they lay down again. It is easy, from the softness of today, to imagine the past in sepia tones, softened by distance. But if we lean closer, if we pause and let our minds wander back, we remember the grit of it, the relentless discipline demanded by survival. For women in the West, especially those in the houses like the Silver Queen, life was measured not in comfort, but in endurance. Dawn meant carrying water up narrow stairs, hands raw from soap that burned as much as it cleaned. Meals were not choices from cupboards, but whatever was left after long nights. Clothing wore thin faster than coins accumulated, and mending became not pastime, but necessity. Each day brought not the question of how to thrive, but how to last until night returned again. And yet, inside that hardness, there were sparks of gentleness. A shared cup of coffee, real coffee hidden from customers, tasted sweeter because it was rare. A letter from home, creased and smudged, could still make eyes glisten with joy. Even a torn dress, carefully patched, carried pride because it meant another evening of work survived. The law of the past was not written to protect them. It loomed as a threat more often than it offered safety. Raids might come at night, fines collected like taxes, dignity stripped in ways that cut deeper than poverty. Respectable society, while accepting their money for schools and roads, refused to look them in the eye. It was a world where judgment was loud, but compassion was quiet, hidden only in the friendships they forged with one another. Contrast this with the present. We can lock our doors at night and trust they will hold. We can see a doctor and expect treatment, not shame. We can work for our own living without hiding our names, without disguising our trades. And perhaps most importantly, women today hold the freedom to imagine futures not bound to a single narrow path. Choices abound, where once only a handful existed. Still, it is worth remembering that our comforts were built on the persistence of those who came before. They endured what we do not have to. They walked roads narrower and darker, and in doing so, they showed that survival can carry dignity, even when the world denies it. The laughter they managed to share, the dreams they whispered of shops and farms and families, are reminders that hope lives even in the tightest corners. Tonight, as you settle beneath soft covers, consider the simple mercies that separate then from now. Running water, steady warmth, a lamp you may switch off when ready. Each of these was once a luxury, distant as stars. To them, a warm bath was celebration, a loaf of fresh bread, a feast, a day without fear, a blessing. The weight they carried makes our lightness visible. And so, while time has moved on, while the houses have fallen silent and the streets no longer echo with their footsteps, their lessons remain. They teach us gratitude. They teach us tenderness. They remind us to notice the ordinary and see it as extraordinary. Echoes of silence. When we close our eyes and lean back into history, there are sounds we do not hear. The thundering of stamp mills grinding through the night, the shuffle of boots on frozen streets, the creak of stairs carrying weary steps up to crowded rooms. All of it fades into silence now. Time has hushed those noises, just as it has softened the sharp edges of lives lived in constant tension. What lingers instead are echoes, carried like whispers across generations. For the women of the brothels, silence was both burden and shield. They could not tell their families the truth of their days. Letters home were carefully worded, describing respectable work as seamstresses or housekeepers. To speak plainly would risk rejection, sever ties that already hung by fragile threads. Silence kept them tethered to some form of belonging, even as it hid their reality. Yet silence was also survival. Secrets kept them safe from lawmen eager to make examples, from townsfolk who scorned them in daylight, from rival houses competing fiercely for trade. Behind quiet doors, in dim-lit parlors, their true voices emerged. They comforted one another in whispers, stitched torn hems with murmured jokes, recited dreams of leaving in hushed tones after midnight. Within that private world, silence became a language of trust. Today, our world asks for less silence. Women may speak openly of their work, their hopes, their hardships. Communities, though imperfect, can hear truths without casting them aside as quickly as before. We read memoirs, watch films, listen to histories that once would have been buried. Where silence once served as protection, now voice serves as recognition. And that change is profound. Still, when we look back, there is value in remembering the quiet strength hidden in those silences. They teach us that words unsaid carried weight. That friendship could be woven not only from conversation, but from presence. A hand steadying another, a glance that reassured without speech, a small act of sharing that spoke louder than declarations. Imagine for a moment sitting in one of those cramped rooms after a long night. 6 women share the space, their breaths heavy with fatigue. No one speaks, for there is nothing new to say. And yet, in that silence, there is understanding. Each knows the other's burdens without naming them. Each feels the bond that only shared hardship can forge. That unspoken fellowship was a balm, however fragile. Contrast that with tonight, where silence feels different. It is chosen, not imposed. You may turn off the television, close a book, and allow quiet to wrap around you without fear. The silence of now is gentle, safe, even healing. It does not conceal shame, but invites rest. And as you listen to the stillness of your room, the hum of a heater, the faint rustle of trees, you sense how far we have come. The echoes of the past remain, though. They remind us not to mistake quiet for emptiness. The silences of yesterday were filled with hidden courage. The silences of today may be filled with gratitude, with peace, with remembrance. In both, the human spirit finds ways to endure. The gentle distance time has a way of smoothing rough edges. What once seemed unbearable becomes a story, softened by distance. The world of so long ago, those smoky parlors, the narrow staircases, the hurried laughter masking fatigue, has slipped behind a curtain of years. What remains is not the sting, but the shape of endurance, the impression left on history like a pressed flower in an old book. The women who lived those lives carried burdens most of us today cannot imagine. Their days were bound by rules harsher than any we know now, laws that punished rather than protected, customs that judged rather than understood, economies that offered them few respectable choices. They endured sickness without real medicine, danger without steady law, and shame without the comfort of recognition. And yet, they lived. They found ways to carve out moments of sweetness, laughter tucked into the corners of hardship. They watched snow fall through cracked windows and called it beautiful. They poured one another cups of strong coffee and called it kindness. They dreamed of new futures, a shop, a farm, a family, and those dreams, fragile though they were, kept them moving forward. The distance between their world and ours is more than years. It is also a change of spirit. Today, the laws that once pressed upon them have loosened their grip. Women speak with their names, work with their rights, and walk with more safety than before. Opportunities have multiplied, choices have widened. The narrow paths of the past have opened into broader roads. Still, remembering matters. To forget their struggles would be to overlook the foundation of resilience laid down quietly in those times. Their endurance whispers to us, reminding us that the comforts of now were not guaranteed, that they were earned across generations of hardship. The hot water from a tap, the clean bed waiting each night, the ease of reaching out for care when unwell. These are luxuries built upon the resilience of those who went without. If you listen carefully, you might still hear them, not in words, but in echoes. A faint laugh in the quiet, the rustle of skirts on wooden stairs, the soft exhale of someone finally resting after too long awake. They do not ask for pity now, only remembrance. They want us to see them not as shadows, but as people who bore their part of the world with the grace they could muster. As you rest tonight, consider how far we have traveled from those narrow cribs to the wide comfort of modern life. Consider, too, how much of their quiet strength still flows in us. For history does not vanish. It settles in our bones, shaping how we carry our own burdens. Now the story draws to its end. The lamps are dim, the footsteps have faded, and only the gentle distance of time remains. May your rest be deep, your dreams kind, and your heart at ease, knowing you lie in gentler days than those who came before. Sleep well.